God, our prayer today is exactly that you will take control of our heart, our mind, our body, our soul, that you will be in charge of all of our lives, that we will trust you. We will know, God, that you are a faithful God and we can count on your promises. We can trust in your promises no matter what we go through in our lives. No matter what storms we encounter, like we've already sung about today, God, you are there. You are there. Still there when everything else seems to be falling apart. And God, as we look at the life of Paul today, would you just bless us and help us to see that in his life? That even though things seemed like they were going from bad to worse in his life, he still trusted you. He heard your voice. He listened. And God, he found strength and power to go on because you are faithful and you keep your word. And we know that as well. We've seen that in our lives. We've seen it in the lives of others. We certainly see it in your word. God, you are faithful. And we say that today with all of our hearts. Take control of our lives. Just be our God. Let us trust you with everything in us. We pray in Jesus' precious name. Amen. All right, thank you. Open your word. Open the word to Acts chapter 27. We're going to continue our study in Acts. We're almost through. One more chapter to go, but they are exciting chapters, I tell you. A lot of amazing things are going to happen in these last two chapters. And as we go through this, I want to give you just a warning again, because I think this is very easy for this to happen. It's very easy for us to treat Paul like he's some sort of superhero. You know, like he's some sort of Superman. And that he goes through all this stuff and he, his faith shines strong and he's preaching the word and he's standing before kings and governors, doing all this great stuff. And we say, yay, Paul, that's great. Go get him, Paul. But that's Paul, that's not me. I just want to caution us against that today because Paul was a man, wasn't he? He wasn't a superhero. He didn't wear some sort of super outfit, He didn't have superpowers. He was a man like you and like me. And I know he suffered the same kinds of difficulties and weaknesses and struggles that we have. We see that in various places in his writings. And I think if we will let him be a man, we will appreciate so much more his faith and his courage, his confidence in God, because we know that if this man, Paul, could be like that, guess what? We can too. Not by our power, but by the power of God in us. And that is the key, church. That's the key because, again, you and I can't do this, but if we trust the Lord, and we allow his power to live in us like the Apostle Paul was doing, we, even though we're human and we have all these failings and all these trials we go through, we also can have that kind of confidence, that kind of faith, that kind of courage that Paul had. So don't treat him like a superhero. He was filled with the Spirit, God, just like you and I can be. And that's where our power is. Paul has been in prison now, where we left him. We left him in prison at Caesarea. And he's been there for about 2 years, maybe a little over 2 years. He has appeared before Governor Felix. Felix left him in prison there, hoping to get a bribe from him to let him out, and never came. He appeared before Governor Festus when Festus replaced Felix. And then he appeared before King Agrippa. You remember that magnificent testimony before King Agrippa, where Paul again for the third time shared the story of his conversion and how he had come to Christ from being a persecutor of Christians to being one who upheld Jesus Christ and brought people to Christ. So this has all happened. I just want to back up just a little bit to chapter 26, verse 29, because it's one of my favorite passages as Paul is appearing before King Agrippa. He says to him, this prayer, he says, verse 29, I pray God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am, except for these chains. What was Paul, church? What was he? was a Christian. He was a disciple. He was a follower of Jesus Christ. He was one who was sold out wall to wall for the Lord. And that no matter where he was, no matter what he was going through, even with the chains on, standing in the midst of all these nobles and dignitaries with all their flowing robes and pomp and ceremony, he's standing here in his chains, in his prison clothes, having been in prison 2 years. He says, I pray, King Agrippa, that you would become what I am, that you become a follower of Jesus Christ. Except for these chains, I don't pray those for you, but I pray that your heart will be sold out for Jesus Christ. Oh, I love that. Jesus is the only way of salvation, the only way of life, and Paul knew that. He had experienced that, and therefore he was willing to stand before the highest of kings, even Caesar himself, and proclaim Jesus Christ as Lord. And then look what Agrippa says at the end of that chapter, verse 32. Agrippa said to Festus, this man could have been set free if he had not appealed to Caesar. Agrippa is convicted that this man is innocent. He has not done anything worthy of imprisonment. He's not done anything worthy of death, and he would have let him go. But Paul, remember, had appealed to Caesar, which was his right as a Roman citizen. And so therefore, he says, to Caesar he shall go. And so, sure enough, in the very next chapter, Paul is going to be put on a boat and going to go on a very long and danger-filled voyage to Rome. And he's going to arrive in Rome, and he's going to testify to Jesus there, just as God had said he would in Acts 23, verse 11, where God appeared to him and said, take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. And Paul was counting on that. He was believing in that promise, that God was going to be faithful to get him to Rome, no matter what lay ahead. And so they begin the journey at the beginning of chapter 27, and it's a fascinating journey. I don't know how much time you have spent. I've probably spent more time with this journey in the last week or so than I've ever spent with it in my life. It's one of those things you sort of read through, and sort of get through. But it's amazing when you really look at it. The journey lasted about 6 months because they had a setback or two along the way. But wow, it's just full of adventure. It's just full of intrigue and excitement and intensity all the way through. And one thing that makes it so exciting is that it's told in the first person. You see, Luke was there with him. Luke was traveling with him. Luke is the author of Acts. And so when he writes it, he's writing in the first person. We did this, we did that. Watch for those we's as he goes through there. Luke is traveling with him on this journey. And so as he writes it, he is writing first-hand accounts. And he writes details, precise details about the trip that would only be known to someone who's right there on the voyage with him. And it's almost like Luke every day was sort of keeping a diary. A daily log of the journey. He's writing down all this stuff, and he records it here in this book. Thomas Walker noted that there is no such detailed record of the working of an ancient ship in the whole of classical literature. Wow, I didn't know that. I haven't read all of classical literature, but he says in all of classical literature, there's no more detailed of the working of an ancient ship than you find right here in this chapter. And James Smith lived back in about 1848, but he was a soldier and he was a sailor himself, and he wrote a book about Paul and his voyage to Rome. And he said that no man who isn't a sailor could have written a narrative of a sea voyage so consistent in all its parts, unless from actual observation. Luke saw it. He was there. And you know what one thing that does for me, kind of a little side note here, is that when I'm trying to show people that the scriptures really are reliable, that they really are the Word of God, this is not something that somebody just sat down and sort of made up. You can turn to Acts 27 and show them right there. This is real. This really happened. And even people who are sea captains look at this and go, whoa, this is exactly right. This was an eyewitness account. Well, they started out from Caesarea, where Paul had been in prison all this time. And I want to show you a map of the voyage, and then we'll sort of walk through it just a little bit. You can follow my little pointer here. There's Caesarea, just north of Jerusalem on the coast. They started there, traveled up to Sidon, up the coast, and then continued up the coast and along the south of Asia here to Mysia, right here. And then along this way, there's Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. Here's Sindus. And then on down and travel to the south of the island of Crete. Here's Lasea. Here's Phoenix. Phoenix will play in this story because they're trying to get to the harbor of Phoenix to winter there, and let the storms pass by and then continue on their voyage. But they never made it. They never made it to the safe harbor of Phoenix. They left there and the winds pushed them out to sea, and around in this area they encounter a storm, a terrible storm at sea, and end up shipwrecked on the island of Malta. And that's why the journey took quite a bit longer than it normally would have taken. We're not going to do all that today. We're going to stop with the shipwreck because I thought there's plenty right here to talk about without going on. We're not going to get to the shipwreck. We're going to stop with the storm. There's plenty to talk about without getting into all the shipwreck stuff. We'll do that next time. But a fascinating account right here. So let's begin, chapter 27. Read with me, if you would, beginning in verse 1. When it was decided that we would set sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Let me note real quickly here that those other prisoners were probably men who had been condemned to death by the Romans, probably mostly Jews, and they were being shipped to Rome to be executed publicly before the Romans. That was something they did. They bring in prisoners from other places and execute them publicly in Rome. And so that's probably who these other prisoners are. Verse 2, we boarded a ship from Adramyttium about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia. And we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. So Paul evidently is traveling with two very close fellow workers, two very close companions. He's got Luke, who's with him, and he also has Aristarchus. Aristarchus pops up a number of times in association with Paul in his writings. In Acts chapter 19, verse 29, he is traveling with Paul right there, and with Gaius. You remember they had this big riot in Ephesus over the silversmiths and all that? Aristarchus and Gaius were seized by the crowd and dragged into the theater. That's Aristarchus, okay? So he's been traveling with Paul quite some time. He is mentioned also in Colossians 4:10 and Philemon, verse 24. He's mentioned with Paul along with Mark. And interesting, in Colossians, Paul calls him my fellow prisoner. He's writing Colossians from Rome, from in prison in Rome. And either Aristarchus was in prison with him as a prisoner, or else he was just there with him, ministering to him. But anyway, he says, my fellow prisoner, Aristarchus. Obviously, Aristarchus is a very close friend, a dear friend, a friend who was willing to lay down his life for Jesus and his life for the Apostle Paul as well. Well, let's continue on here. Verse 3. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. That tells you a lot about Paul right there. How the respect that the Romans had for Paul. Here's this Roman commander, Julius. When they land at port, he allows him to go to his friend's home to have his needs cared for. Maybe there was a soldier with him, I don't know, but they respected Paul. They knew he wasn't a criminal. He had not been condemned in any court to this point. And so even though he's under arrest and being transported to Rome as a prisoner, they had a lot of respect for this man, Paul. In verse 4, from there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Sindus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, to the southerly side where the winds wouldn't hit them as hard. We sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite Salome. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Now, watch this. Verse 9, much time had been lost. They had been battling the winds. A lot of time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. What fast? That is Yom Kippur. That is the Day of Atonement. Literally, the Day of Atonement is Yom Kippur in Hebrew. So when you hear about the Jews today celebrating Yom Kippur, they're celebrating the Day of Atonement. It was one of the most high and holy days in all Israel. It was the day when the high priest would go into the most holy place and offer there the blood of a calf on top of the mercy seat for his sins and the sins of all the people. It was the only time in the whole year when a man could enter into the very holy place of God, the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctuary, and the high priest would do that. And you remember when Jesus was killed? We sang about it a moment ago. When he died, what happened to the veil of the temple? You remember, church? He was torn from top to bottom. It was rent in half, torn from top to, that thing was as thick as a man's hand across this way. It was torn from the top to the bottom. And Jesus, our high priest, entered into that place and offered on the mercy seat not the blood of an animal, but whose blood? His own blood. He gave his own blood for us because the sins of of goats and calves, as Hebrews says, cannot continue to take away sins. They don't have power over sin, but the blood of Jesus Christ did. And so that's what the Day of Atonement was all about. It was a day when the high priest would enter that holy place, and it was looking forward to the day when the Son of God, our high priest, would enter the holy place once and for all, tear apart the veil, making a way for us to enter into the very presence of God ourselves. Isn't that amazing? I love how the Old Testament just points forward to all these things that are going to happen. Well, the Jews, obviously then and still today, who don't believe in Jesus, are still celebrating Yom Kippur, still looking forward to the day when the Messiah will come, not realizing, not believing, not accepting that he has come already. But what's significant about this day here is that Yom Kippur, back in about AD 59, when this happened, was on October the 5th. We know that from historical records. It was on October the 5th. And what's significant about that is that that was right in the middle of the storm season. The storm season lasted from about mid-September to mid-November. That was probably one of the more dangerous times to travel. And after November 11th or so, they would not travel at all. And so it was very important that they get to some kind of a safe harbor where they could winter before the mid-November. And they're already to October 5th, and the winds are gaining intensity, the storms are coming, and it's very dangerous traveling at that time. Well, let's go on. So Paul warned them. Verse 10, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our lives also. How did Paul know that? Well, he had a lot of experience. Paul had traveled probably about 11 different voyages already in his missionary journeys. Someone smarter than me counted all that up and said he had logged about 3,500 miles of sea travel just on his 3 missionary journeys. That's not counting this one. He'd already logged about 3,500 miles of sea travel just in the Mediterranean Sea. And in fact, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 25, he says he had already been shipwrecked for 3 times. 3 times he says, I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. He's out there floating in the open sea from a shipwreck. You talk about experience. This man knew what he was talking about. So he says, I warn you now, we need to stop. We need to stay here in this harbor. Let's don't go ahead. There's going to be great loss to ship and cargo, to our lives also. But, verse 11, but the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, bad news, don't do that. Instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority, never trust a majority, okay? We've learned that, haven't we? The majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. Phoenix evidently was a better harbor. This was a harbor in Crete, it says, facing both southwest, northwest. It'd be a better place to find shelter for the ship and to find lodging and to wait out the winter before they traveled on. So that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to travel on to Phoenix, hoping to make it there and winter there for the next several months. Well, verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they thought they had obtained what they wanted. The winds are fair, let's go, okay? So they weighed anchor and they sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster. We call it a nor'easter sometimes. A wind of hurricane force swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. They're being driven along by this wind, this powerful storm that had come up. And verse 16, as we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. These ancient ships, what they would do is they would tow the lifeboat behind the ship. It wasn't lashed to the side. They would tow it behind the ship. And so what they've done is they pulled the lifeboat in and secured it to the ship in some way so the storm and the waves won't blow it away. And then look what they did. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. And from my research, that was a very common practice. In fact, these ships would be outfitted with some cables, very strong cables. And they would actually wrap the ship with these cables. I can't imagine doing that in a storm, but they did it. They would run those cables underneath the ship, wrap it around so it would help hold the ship together as it was buffeted by the violent waves. And then fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. They lowered the sea anchor, and the word there is not necessarily the word for anchor. Probably it was the anchor, but it may have been some other stuff as well. And they drag it out behind the ship to create a drag, to create something that would slow the ship down and give it some stability in the currents and the waves. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, look at this, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. They have reached a point of desperation, of no hope. They've done everything they can, thrown everything overboard they can to lighten the load, to keep the ship from sinking, to keep it afloat, and yet the sun, stars, nothing has appeared. The storm rages on, and without abating, just growing in intensity, and finally even the sailors themselves, those experienced men on board sailing the ship, and all the prisoners, everyone else, gave up hope that they would ever be saved. I don't know if you've ever reached a point like that in your life. Maybe you have. Maybe you've reached a point in your life at some time where you have given up all hope of being saved. I've talked to a lot of people who said, I came right to the brink of taking my life. Right to the brink of putting a gun to my head or taking those pills or jumping off that bridge or whatever it was. Something to take my life because I gave up all hope of being saved. I didn't see the stars. I didn't see the moon. I didn't see life. I didn't see any hope of going on. All I saw was a storm that battered me. And I gave up all hope of being saved. There are people out there like that right now. There might be someone in here today just like that, who's reached that point in their lives where you just feel like, what's the point? Why go on? Why even try? I've lost everything that was meaningful to me. I don't see the point in continuing on. And maybe you can identify with what these men felt. We're going to die. There is no hope. But I want you to see something here. We're not going to end that way, because there is hope. But you have to have faith. Listen, verse 21. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and he said, "Men," I love this about Paul. I can identify with Paul, can't you? "Men, you should have listened to me." Yeah. You should have. He can't help but just get in a little dig, I told you, you should have listened to me, but you didn't, You should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete, and then you would have been spared this damage and this loss. But now, listen to him now. He doesn't leave there. He's not just trying to get in a dig. He wants to give them hope. So listen to what he says. "But now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Because last night an angel of the God whose I am and who I serve," I love how he says that, don't you? The God who I belong to. The God whose I am. The God I serve. Last night an angel of that God appeared to me. And he said to me, "Do not be afraid, Paul. Do not be afraid." Maybe Paul was afraid. Maybe that's where we can identify with Paul and understand that he was human. He had fears as well. And Luke and Aristarchus and those guys who believed, they were afraid, perhaps. But he says, "Don't be afraid. You must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island." Now, isn't that encouraging? That is so encouraging to me. That here, Paul, even though he was afraid, I'm sure, like the rest of them, and maybe part of him, that human part of him, even though he knew God had said, "You're going to get to Rome," there's still that human part of you that says, "Yeah, really? Really? Am I really going to make it? God, I heard that promise, but was I just having a nightmare or something, Was that just a dream? Is that really real? Look at the storm. Sometimes when we look out, like Peter looking at the waves, where we start to sink, even though Jesus is standing right there, because we're looking at the wrong thing. And so maybe he was looking at the wrong thing. God has to appear to him again and say, "Paul, stop it. Listen to me. Don't be afraid. I'm going to save you. Ship's going to be lost. You're going to run aground on some island, and you and all 276 passengers on the ship, you're going to be saved. Not going to lose one guy. I promise you." And Paul was encouraged. He took courage because he says, "I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." I love Paul's confidence in God's faithfulness. This was the same God who had been asleep in the back of the boat. You remember when the disciples were on the Sea of Galilee? And they were caught in the storm? And they were fearing for their lives. They thought, this is it, we're going to die here. And so they went back and they shook Jesus and said, don't you care? Don't you care that we're about to die here? And Jesus got up and he said, oh, guys, where's your faith? Don't you trust me? And he stood up and said, hush, peace, be still. And the waves, whoa. And it was just like everything came to a stop. Right there. Even the inanimate objects, the winds and the waves and the sea obeyed the voice of their Creator. They heard their Creator, and sometimes we don't, but they did. I find that amazing. This was the same God who had walked on the water toward the boat. You remember in the middle of the night on the Sea of Galilee again, another storm, another story. And the disciples were scared and they saw him, look, a ghost is coming out, we're going to die. Maybe we're dead already, I don't know. And Jesus called out to them and says, don't fear, don't be afraid. It's me. It's Jesus. And when he stepped on board the boat, you remember what happened? As soon as he stepped in the boat, the wind and the waves stopped, the storm was still, and they were at their destination, just like that. You talk about a God who can still the winds and the waves. A God that we can find courage and strength in, even in the midst of the storms of life. That's the kind of God we serve, church. That's the kind of God you and I have. And when we go through those storms, we can trust in that God, can't we? Amen? Yes. I remember John Newton, the one who wrote Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound, back when before he became a Christian. He was a slave ship captain, remember that? One night they were caught in a violent storm at sea, and it seemed like everything was lost. It seemed like there was no hope, and there was a group of Moravian Christians on board, and they were sitting in a little huddle on the deck of the ship, praying and singing to God. That reminds me of Paul and Silas sitting in prison in Philippi, praying and singing after they've been beaten and locked in stocks. Because their eyes were not on this world, their eyes were on Jesus Christ, the one who gives new life now and forever. And these Moravian Christians, believers, were praying in the midst of the storm and just praising the Lord. And John Newton saw that, and it changed his life. And when he stepped off that ship, he stepped off a new man. He says, I'm never going back to this corrupt trade. I'm going to give my life to Christ. And he did. He became a pastor. And he wrote, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saves a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. How are you doing with the storms in your life? How are you doing? Are you ready for the storms that are going to come? Now, I don't want to be a downer here today, but I promise you, storms are coming. They are. James said, when you face various trials. He didn't say, if you face various trials. He said, when you face various trials, trials of various kinds. So they're coming. I know they're coming in our lives. Are you ready? Are you prepared? Will your faith hold strong in the midst of that storm? I know we don't like the storms. I don't like them. But you know, a lot of good can come from those storms, because in the face of those storms, we have an opportunity to have faith in God and see God come through for us in a powerful way. Just last Thursday night, I had one of my students in class get up and tell the story of losing her child. And it was before she had become a Christian. She lost a child. And as she told the story and weeping and everything about this, even though it's been 5 years ago, she said, you know, I was so angry at God. So angry at God that God would take my child. She didn't even know God at that point. But she was angry at him. That's always puzzled me. The people who don't even know God are angry at God. Something in them knows God's there, but they don't feel like he was there for them at that moment. And she didn't feel like that. So she blamed God. But then one night she had a vision. And she saw a vision of apparently either God himself or an angel, a figure in a beautiful white light with his arms stretched out, holding her baby, holding her child in his arms. And she said, God said to me, I've got your baby. He's mine. I will take care of him. And she became a Christian after that, became a believer. And she stood up in my class the other night and shared how God, through that trial, through that difficulty, through that storm of life, as hard as it was, as much as she struggled, God taught her that he's always there. And not to put our confidence in this life and things that we think bring us joy and peace, but to put our confidence in God, who sees us through the storm of life. He's got us. And as I was preparing, my mind went to a young man that he and his brother, some of you will know Young Ho and Sun Ho Pak, Korean young men who were in a school that I taught in, high school. And Young Ho, later on in life, met up with a young gal from Kansas. And a young American gal from Kansas, and fell in love with this young gal from Kansas. Only one problem. He's Korean. In his culture, you don't marry outside your culture. Another problem, her parents were very prejudiced, very bigoted. And they didn't want her marrying some Korean guy. He wasn't from Kansas. He didn't look like from Kansas. He was different. We don't want you marrying. And it was horrible. I mean, Young Ho shared with me the story of the pain they went through, the agony they went through, because on both sides there was a struggle. And it was worse on her side because her dad said, no way am I blessing your marriage. No way am I paying for it. No way will you ever be a part of our family again if you marry this Korean guy. Broke her heart. Talk about a storm. She was in a storm. Well, I don't know if you remember, a number of years ago, there was a tornado in Kansas, a big one, and it went through this little town where her parents lived, where this gal's parents lived. And he had his house there. He had a big, nice barn out back with shop and all his tools in it and all this stuff. The tornado went right through that town. They went down in the storm cellar underneath the house. And when they came out, it was all gone. The house was gone. The barn was gone. The tools were gone. It was all gone. It's like somebody had just wiped it clean with a tractor or something. It was all gone. Just the foundation of the house was left. It wasn't long after that this young lady got a call from her dad and said, honey, I've been wrong. I've been so wrong. That storm taught me a lesson. That there are things much more valuable to me in life than my house, my storage shed, and my barns and all this stuff, or even my feelings about your marriage. If you love that young man, you marry him, and we will bless you. Can you learn things in a storm? Can storms sometimes change your life and turn you from the error of your ways to the Lord and grant you grace that you can grant to others? Amen. I can tell you about a lot of storms. One of the first ones that really impacted me so much was what happened to an older gentleman who was very influential in my life. Jack was, when I was younger, he directed a little singing group, a little folk singing group that I was part of. It really meant a lot to me. And I got to sing for several years with this little group, and I was in high school, and his kids meant a lot to me, and it was his son, David, was a blessing to me. He taught me how to play guitar and all the stuff. Some years after that, Jack and his son, David, and David's two children, Jack's grandsons, were out on Lake Yellowstone. And a violent storm came up. A violent wind that they weren't expecting came up. Swamped their little fishing boat. And Jack lost his son, David, and his two grandchildren, drowned in Lake Yellowstone. And Jack was able to make it to the shore. I remember him telling that story. And someone asked him, Jack, were you angry at God? You lost your son. You lost 2 grandchildren in a storm. Weren't you angry at God? Did you have a moment when you doubted God? I still remember Jack's answer. He said, no, not a moment. I grieved, yes. He probably grieved till the day he died. But never for a moment did he doubt God and God's grace and God's love. That God was with him through that storm. And I see in that what the Apostle Paul is saying here to me today and to you. That even though we go through the storms of life, and God will not always protect us from those storms of life, that in those storms God is still there. And that sometimes he even works, not that he sends the storms, but he works through those storms to bring us even closer to him. Fear sometimes is a catalyst that brings us to God and helps us trust in the things that really matter in life. In fact, the safest place to be in the middle of a storm is next to your Father. It's the safest place to be. So are you ready for the storms of life? How are you doing right now, maybe in the middle of the storm that you're in at this moment? When God comes to you and says, don't be afraid, I'm here. You may lose a lot. You may lose this ship. You may lose the cargo. You may lose your belongings, but I've got you. And even if you lose your life, I've got you. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to turn to God? Maybe today would be the day you need to turn to God. Just say, God, I'm yours. I want to give you my life. I want to give you my fears. I want to trust you with everything. What are you struggling with right now that maybe you just need to surrender to God and hear God say again to you, hey, don't be afraid. I've got this. Maybe today is that day you need to do that. I'd like to ask our leaders and our prayer leaders, why don't you stand with me, please? Let's just, everybody, and let's ask our leaders, our prayer leaders, to maybe make their way around the room. And if there's something going on in your life right now that you need to give to God and your life, trust Him with your life, or maybe it's a storm you're going through, let's all stand. Maybe it's a storm you're going through and you just need to pray with somebody and say, I just want to give this to you, God, right now. Would you just stand with me right now where you are, and let's begin to do that right now. Maybe you need to pray with somebody. Do that. God, we just want to surrender to you right now our lives. Sometimes we put our hope and our trust in the wrong things, God, and we need a storm to take those things away and maybe restore our vision to focus on the things that really do matter. So God, when those storms come, we pray that our faith will be strong in you because we know you're still there. You promised you would be, that you will not leave us, you will not forsake us. You will walk through that valley of the shadow of death. You will always be there. And so God, we praise you for that, and we ask you today to help us to have that kind of faith and kind of confidence in you, God. You are God. And when those oceans rise and when those storm clouds roar, God, we want to soar with you above the storm. You are king over the flood, God. You are king over the flood. God, so may we be still and just know that you are God. We trust you and we love you. And I pray today that anybody here, any one of us, that's struggling in any way with this idea of trusting you will find our hope, our strength in you. And God, if we need to pray with somebody, if we need to make that known, whatever, God, please use this time right now. And God, I just want to sing about a man who lost his wife and his children in a storm. And yet, Lord, he could say, it is well, it is well.